The sound of a quiet evening filled the apartment, but it wasn't peace, it was distance disguised as calm. Aiden sat by the window, watching the faint orange light fade across the skyline. Mira was somewhere behind him, moving without words, the soft clink of a cup, the shuffle of bare feet. He'd grown used to her silence lately. It had a rhythm that said more than her voice ever did. Something in the air had shifted days ago, though neither had the courage to admit it. She spoke only when necessary, and even then, her tone carried something brittle, unfinished. He looked at her reflection in the glass, just movement, no face, no warmth. When she spoke, her voice came low, detached. "You didn't reply to my message earlier." Aiden turned, forcing calm. "Didn't see it," he lied, though he had. He'd seen her message, short and ordinary, yet loaded with a quiet test he couldn't name. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a notification lit the screen. The name, Eli. He looked away. She picked it up casually, said something about meeting friends later. Eli again. The tone in which she said it carried no guilt, just confidence, like she wanted him to notice but wouldn't admit it. He wanted to ask why she'd been spending so much time with Eli, but swallowed the thought. Confrontation, he'd learned, sometimes gave people permission to lie more beautifully. Instead, he said, "Late night." "Maybe," she replied, rinsing her cup. "Don't wait up." Her words were simple, but the silence that followed burned. He watched her dry her hands slowly, not looking at him, not asking if he cared. That was her way, testing care without asking for it. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of feeling jealous over someone he trusted. Yet trust felt like something slowly slipping out of his control, like a thread unraveling in his own hands. He distracted himself by scrolling his phone, checking meaningless updates. Myra's laugh from another room drew his attention. She was on a call. The laughter sounded rehearsed, too precise. He turned off his phone and stared at the ceiling. The idea came to him that love rarely ends loudly, it just stops. Returning calls. Dinner was quiet. The clink of cutlery was the only conversation. Mira, half distracted, asked suddenly, "Do you think people cheat because they're bored, or because they're missing something?" Aiden lifted his gaze, surprised by the bluntness. "Depends what they're missing," he said carefully. She nodded, studying him, like his answer was a clue. "And if I cheated?" He froze mid-bite. "Then I'd stop seeing you the same way." Her voice softened, almost curious. "Not forgive me?" "No," he said it without hesitation. "Once trust breaks, it doesn't heal, it mutates." She smiled faintly, like she'd expected the answer. "So if you ever thought I did, you'd walk away?" "I wouldn't need to think," he said. "I'd know." Her eyes lingered on him for a long second, unreadable. Then she stood, carried her plate away, and said nothing more. The air in the room turned heavy, filled with things unspoken. Later, as she got ready to leave, Aiden noticed she took longer than usual. Perfume, careful adjustments, quiet hums. He leaned on the doorway, watching without comment. She didn't ask if he'd mind her going out, she didn't have to. When she said, "I'll be back late," he just nodded. She hesitated as if expecting him to stop her. He didn't. She gave a small, almost disappointed shrug and left. The sound of the door clicking shut felt final, like a decision had been made long before tonight. He sat in the silence she left behind, the clock ticking louder than usual. He tried reading, but the words blurred. Every minute stretched into suspicion. He thought about Eli, how Mira mentioned him too often, how she'd laugh differently when his name came up. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. Doubt, once it enters love, doesn't need proof, it only needs time. He poured himself a drink he didn't want, stared at the condensation sliding down the glass. His mind replayed her question at dinner, if I cheated. He'd answered honestly, but perhaps honesty was the wrong choice. Maybe love wasn't about truth but illusion, the comforting kind that keeps people from testing each other. He opened his phone again, saw no new messages. The contact name, Mira Red Heart, blinked back like irony. He considered calling but stopped himself. Pride dressed itself as patience. It felt safer that way. The night grew quieter, and the apartment colder. He imagined her laughter somewhere else, her hand brushing someone's shoulder, maybe Eli's. The thought made his stomach tighten. Not because he feared losing her, but because he feared being right. Hours passed. The clock struck midnight, then 1. When she finally returned, he pretended to be asleep. She moved softly through the space, setting her bag down, pausing by his side. He could sense her watching him, though her face stayed in the dark. For a moment, she brushed her hand near his, almost touching, then withdrew. He kept still. When she slipped into bed beside him, the distance between them felt immeasurable. Her breathing steadied, but his didn't. He realized this was how trust ends, not with confrontation, but with quiet acceptance of what you can't prove. He stared into the dark. The words he should have said stuck in his throat. Sometimes, he thought, people test love not because they doubt you, but because they already know they're guilty of something. He closed his eyes, hearing her soft breaths, the faint hum of the night outside. The air smelled faintly of unfamiliar perfume. He didn't ask. He wouldn't. Love, after all, was about pretending you didn't notice the moment it began to die. Sometimes loyalty isn't proven by staying. It's proven by how silently you watch someone drift away.
Morning came quietly, as if the world itself was careful not to disturb what had broken overnight. The house looked the same, but the air inside carried the heaviness of unspoken guilt. Maya moved through the kitchen mechanically, her hands doing what her mind refused to. The sound of Rayhan's door remained closed, and she didn't dare knock. Between them now existed a silence sharper than any words could ever be. She wanted to believe time would dull it, that pretending would fix what truth had shattered, but even silence had a pulse, and she could feel it every time she breathed. When Rayhan finally came out, his face was pale, his eyes swollen from a sleepless night. He greeted her softly, avoiding eye contact, and she answered with the same hollow politeness. They spoke of ordinary things, breakfast, the weather, his classes, but each word felt artificial, rehearsed. There was no anger, no confrontation, only the heavy politeness of two people pretending they had not crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The simple rhythm of daily life became their disguise. Days slipped by. Faisal called once from another city, asking if everything was fine. Maya said yes. Her voice sounded calm even though her heart wasn't. Rayhan stood nearby, listening, guilt flickering across his face. When the call ended, she turned to him briefly, wanting to say something, anything, but words wouldn't come. They both went back to their separate silences, each drowning in their own version of regret. At night, Maya lay awake, replaying his words over and over. If he doesn't love you, let me be the one who does. They echoed inside her mind until she wanted to scream. It wasn't the sentence itself that haunted her, but what it revealed, how much her own sadness had shaped it. She had spent years starving for affection, and in her loneliness, she had allowed boundaries to blur. Rayhan's request was wrong, but it was born from the very emptiness she had carried. That realization made her shame even deeper. Rayhan, meanwhile, became distant. He stopped sitting with her, avoided her eyes, and left early for university. He moved like someone trying to punish himself quietly. His laughter disappeared, replaced by long silences and guilt he couldn't hide. One night, Maya found a piece of paper on the dining table, a letter written in his neat handwriting. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple confession of remorse. He wrote that he didn't know what came over him, that he hated himself for saying what he said, and that he wished she could forget it ever happened. At the end, he had written, "I only wanted you to be happy." I forgot what that meant. She folded the letter carefully and kept it in a drawer she never opened again. When Faisal finally returned home after weeks, the irony was cruel. He brought gifts, spoke with fake warmth, and acted like everything was fine. He didn't notice the strained quiet between his wife and son. He was too used to silence to see that this one was different. During dinner, he joked about how Rayhan had become the man of the house. Maya forced a smile. Rayhan excused himself early. Faisal didn't notice the tremor in her hand when she picked up her glass. That night, Maya stood by Rayhan's door for a long time before knocking. When he opened it, she saw in his eyes a boy crushed under the weight of something he couldn't undo. She didn't lecture or scold. Her voice was soft, tired, but steady. She told him that they would never speak of that night again, not because she wanted to forget it, but because remembering it would destroy them both. "We'll move forward," she said quietly, "and you'll promise me to live your life, not carry my pain." He nodded, tears gathering but unfallen. For a moment, they stood in silence that felt almost forgiving. That he said, "I'm sorry, Mama." She replied, "I know," and placed her hand lightly on his head before walking away. That simple gesture, pure, motherly, final, closed the distance between guilt and forgiveness without a single word more. It didn't erase what had happened, but it anchored it in a place where it could no longer grow. In the days that followed, life settled into a fragile rhythm again. Rayhan focused on his studies, Maya on her work. Faisal continued to drift in and out, oblivious to the emotional ruins he had left behind. But something inside both Maya and Rayhan had changed permanently. Their bond remained, but it was different now, restrained, quiet, shaped by an unspoken promise never to repeat the past. Sometimes, when the house grew quiet at night, Maya would hear the faint echo of rain and feel the weight of that memory pressing at the edges of her mind. It didn't hurt anymore, it simply reminded her how thin the line was between love and loneliness. She no longer blamed him entirely. She blamed time, distance, and silence. The perfect storm that had swallowed judgment. Years would pass, and no one outside those walls would ever know the truth. Rayhan would grow older, leave for work in another city, build his own life. Maya would remain where she was, living a version of peace that came with acceptance rather than forgetting. Sometimes his calls would come late at night, short and polite, and she would hear in his voice that same quiet care, this time with the right distance between them. And though the past remained unspoken, it lingered in the air of that house like the faint scent of rain after a storm, proof that something had happened once, something that changed them both forever. The narrator's voice would fade over that silence. Sometimes betrayal has no villain, and forgiveness has no hero. It is just two hearts learning to live with what they cannot erase. Some truths are not confessed because they are too dark, but because speaking them would only keep them alive. And so they carried it quietly, she as a mother who forgave, and he as a son who would never forgive himself. The house stood still, ordinary to the world, yet inside its walls lived a story no one would ever tell again, a story of love misunderstood, of silence mistaken for safety, of a truth that would sleep forever between them, untouched, but never truly gone. Days passed, but the silence between us grew heavier. Imran no longer teased me about his strange question, but it lived between every word we didn't say. He was there, present, polite, predictable, but emotionally miles away. Sometimes I caught him watching me as if searching for something, and when our eyes met, he'd just look away. I told myself it was work stress, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had shifted since that night. His wish had planted a thought neither of us could unthink. Then came the afternoon I met Ryan again. It wasn't planned. He showed up at the same cafe I went to after work, and when he spotted me, his smile felt like sunlight breaking through a cloud I didn't know I'd been living under. We talked again, small things at first, harmless things. He asked about my writing, about Imran, about life. He had a calm way of listening, of making silence feel safe. When I left, I told myself it was nothing. Just conversation. But the warmth stayed with me all evening, Imran noticed. He noticed everything. He looked at me differently that night, his tone sharp but quiet. "You've been smiling a lot lately," he said, not as a compliment, more as an observation. I asked what he meant, but he just shrugged. "I'm glad you're happy." The words sounded kind, but they carried something cold. It wasn't approval, it was detachment. Like he'd already stepped outside of the marriage and was watching me from a distance. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm of confusion. Imran became unpredictable, sometimes attentive, sometimes distant, sometimes almost cruel in how calm he seemed. I couldn't read him anymore. I tried to bring up that night, to ask what he really meant when he said those things, but he always brushed it off. "It was just a thought experiment," he'd say. "You think too much." But the damage was already done. I started thinking all the time about what honesty really meant, about what he was trying to prove. Ryan kept appearing in small ways, texting about something he saw that reminded him of our talk, inviting me to a charity event, asking if I'd had lunch. I tried to resist, but each exchange felt like a small rescue from the emptiness at home. His words filled spaces Imran had left hollow. I told myself it was friendship, that I needed someone to talk to, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But every time I heard my phone buzz, my heart beat faster than it should have. One night, I told Imran I'd run into Ryan again. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "If you ever do something, just don't lie to me about it." I froze. There was no accusation in his voice, just quiet certainty. Like he was setting a rule for a game I hadn't agreed to play. I asked him what that meant, but he didn't answer. He kissed my forehead, wished me good night, and turned away. After that, I couldn't sleep. His words kept echoing, twisting, turning. Was he giving me permission, or daring me to betray him? Was he so sure I wouldn't, or did he secretly want me to? I wanted to believe it was a test, but part of me feared it wasn't. Part of me feared he meant every word. The following week, Ryan and I met again. It happened naturally. He offered to drop me home after a meeting that ran late. The car ride was quiet, filled with unsaid things. When he parked outside my building, he looked at me with concern. "You look like you're carrying too much," he said softly. I didn't respond. He didn't push. But when I turned to leave, he touched my hand, brief, uncertain, gentle. It should have meant nothing, but it felt like everything I'd been starved of. I pulled away, whispered a goodbye, and walked inside trembling. That night, I stared at Imran while he slept. His breathing was calm, steady, peaceful. For a moment, I hated him for how easily he slept, for how effortlessly he'd placed this storm inside me and then walked away from it. I wanted to shake him, to ask him if this was what he wanted, to turn me into someone who questioned her own reflection. Instead, I whispered the question he once asked me: if you ever wanted someone else, would you tell me? He didn't answer. Of course, days turned into a blur of messages, glances, guilt. Ryan never crossed a line, not until the night the rain wouldn't stop. I'd stayed late at work, the roads were flooding, and he offered to drop me home again. The drive was quiet. The world outside was blurred with rain, and everything felt suspended in that moment. When the car stopped, I didn't move. He looked at me, and I looked back. There was no plan, no logic, just exhaustion, warmth, and the ache of being seen. What happened next wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, almost sad. A moment that felt both wrong and inevitable. When it was over, the guilt didn't come instantly. It arrived later, slowly, like fog. I sat there afterward, unable to speak. Ryan said my name once, softly, as if afraid to break the air. I didn't answer. I just left. When I got home, Imran's car was in the driveway. He was inside, pretending to sleep on the couch. I knew he'd been waiting. I didn't know if he suspected anything, but I couldn't meet his eyes. I went straight to bed, lay there in the dark, and whispered into the silence, "I did what you wished." The words hurt more than the act itself. By morning, everything looked normal again. Breakfast, routine, work, nothing had changed, except everything had. I carried on, mechanical and numb, waiting for something: guilt, confession, forgiveness, but none came. Imran didn't ask, and I didn't tell. Maybe that was his wish all along, to see how far I would go, and how quietly I could live with it.
The weeks after Aiden left moved in fragments, pieces of days that no longer fit together. Mira went through the motions of living, working, talking, existing, but nothing carried weight anymore. The apartment echoed with absence, every object a reminder of his quiet departure. His coffee mug sat untouched on the counter, his jacket still hanging by the door, his scent fading slower than she wanted it to. She thought about removing those traces, but part of her couldn't. They were proof that he had once been real, that what she destroyed hadn't been imagined. She told friends they had taken a break, that things had grown complicated. The lies rolled off easily. Truth had become a language she no longer spoke. What she didn't say was that she kept replaying the moment he turned away, the final calmness in his voice, the lack of anger that hurt more than rage ever could. She had begged for emotion, and when he finally gave her indifference, she realized that was worse than hate. Nights were longer now. She lay awake, scrolling through old messages, rereading them as if she could find the precise word where everything shifted. But there wasn't one. Love didn't collapse in a single sentence, it withered in 1,000 small silences. She had thought the test would give her control. Instead, it left her begging for the smallest trace of what she had taken for granted. One afternoon, she saw him again, by chance. Aiden was walking across the street, talking to someone, calm and composed. The woman beside him, Lara, smiled lightly, holding a cup of coffee he must have bought her. Myra's breath caught. They weren't touching, yet the ease between them was unmistakable. No tension, no performance, just peace. She stayed hidden, watching, realizing that this was the difference between what she had and what she lost. With her, he'd learned to guard his emotions. With Lara, he didn't have to. When she got home, she stood in front of the mirror, tracing the faint lines around her mouth from sleepless nights. She no longer recognized the person who had once believed love needed to be tested to feel real. The irony was cruel. She'd built her experiment on the fear of losing him, and that fear had fulfilled itself perfectly. She didn't cry anymore. Tears had become useless currency. Later, she drafted a message she'd never sent. I didn't want to break us. I just wanted to know if we could survive doubt. She deleted it. Words didn't mean anything to someone who'd already stopped listening. Instead, she wrote it down on paper, folded it, and placed it inside his old mug, as if the gesture could substitute closure. Across town, Aiden sat alone in his new apartment, smaller, quieter, cleaner. He wasn't seeing Lara, at least not yet, but they spoke often. It wasn't romance, it was recovery through simplicity. He found comfort in conversations that didn't require decoding. Still, sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, Myra's voice drifted through his thoughts, and the sharp, trembling way she'd said, I just wanted to know if you'd fight for me. He realized then that he had fought, just not the way she wanted. He had fought to stay dignified, to preserve what little trust remained, and when it failed, he fought the urge to hate her. He hadn't succeeded entirely. Part of him still carried the bruise of her manipulation, not because of what she did, but because of what it revealed, how love could be weaponized under the name of curiosity. He wondered if she'd learned anything or if she still believed she'd only made a small mistake. Mira tried to distract herself with routines, new friends, new places, new versions of herself. But everything felt rehearsed, hollow. Sometimes she imagined Aiden reading her apology, even though it didn't exist. She pictured him forgiving her quietly, maybe even missing her in flashes of memory, but deep down, she knew he wouldn't. His silence was permanent now. He had become someone who measured love not by words, but by what wasn't said. Months later, she heard from a mutual friend that Aiden had transferred to another city for work. No explanation, no farewell message. Just gone. That night, she opened their old chat thread and scrolled all the way up to the first message she ever sent him. You seem hard to read. The irony stung. He hadn't been hard to read, she had just never learned how to listen without suspicion. Time passed, but some truths refused to fade. Love built on tests becomes a contest, and contests always end with someone losing. She had wanted certainty. Instead, she got the one result she couldn't undo, a man who once loved her completely now remembering her only as a lesson. Aiden, sitting in a quiet cafe one evening, scrolled through his phone. A message from Mira appeared at the top, unread for days. It said simply, I'm sorry for everything. He didn't open it. He just watched the notification disappear when the screen dimmed. Some closures, he thought, come not from responding, but from realizing you no longer need to. He finished his coffee, glanced out the window, and caught his reflection in the glass, older, steadier, distant. For the first time, he didn't feel anger or regret. Just acceptance. Love, he finally understood, doesn't survive experiments. It survives trust. And once that's gone, all that remains are stories people tell themselves to make sense of the silence. Mira, alone in the apartment that once echoed with his voice, finally accepted what she'd done. There was no big ending, no confrontation, no redemption. Just consequence. She sat by the window where he once used to sit, tracing the faint scratch on the glass his ring had made one evening when he leaned too close. It was the last physical mark he'd left behind, she whispered into the still air. I thought I could control what love meant. But control had been the opposite of love, and she realized it too late. The world outside moved on. People laughed, lights flickered in distant apartments, lives overlapped and separated. But inside her, the story remained frozen. The night she tested him, the silence that followed, the man who never came back, that he had been right all along. You don't measure love to prove it exists. You protect it by never needing to. And as the night deepened, Mira finally spoke the words she should have said months ago, not to him, but to herself. I tested his love and lost my own in the process. Some truths arrive quietly, long after the damage is done. Some endings don't need closure, they just need distance. I and trying to prove he'd stay after betrayal, she ended up proving that even love, when tested too far, learns to walk away without looking back.